So right now I'm kind of going into the same scene and cleaning the lighting palette, as it were, to set up a blank scene again to just place down a directional light to get light and shadow composition going. So I deleted all my lights, my atmospheric fog, my post-process volume, and obviously still there's a lot of light going on here in this scene. And so in order to completely get rid of it and start with a blank scene, I need to go to my world settings, go under the light mask tab, and check this box that says force no pre-computed lighting. Click OK. And then if I go to build lighting only, that will completely wipe out all the lighting data that was in the scene here. I'm just going to check that back off, so the next time we build lighting, that will no longer stop the global illumination from being generated. So this will have no computed lighting be built, so you just need to make sure to check that off again once you start baking lighting again. So one thing looking into here is a big part of the composition comes from just very simple light and shadow shapes. When looking into really good art, in order to set up how light and shadow adds to the composition and all the composition lessons that we were going through before, which is, shape language, composition, perspective, a sense of atmospheric perspective, there's one other factor that we're going to throw into the mix here, which is the light and the shadow side, which really makes up a huge part of the overall composition of most images in a way. And a great type of artwork to look for this is pen and ink work or comic book work. This right here is a pen and ink work by Frank Frazetta. And what you're seeing here is just you have to have a very clear, distinct light side and shadow side when you're working with ink and really any kind of comic work in general, because you need to come up with very graphic shapes without a lot of form shadow or form turning values in between. So you can see here just a very clear sense of there's a light side, there's a shadow side, and that's distinctly demonstrated between a light and a pretty much pure black side. There are values in between here that you can see to turn the form, but really it's a pretty distinct sense of a light side and a shadow side. And in other forms of artwork too, you can see here in Frank Miller with Sin City, there's a really great sense of there's a clear light side, there's a clear shadow side, there's only two values in this scene pretty much, but you can still get a clear sense of what exactly is going on with this scene, that it's clearly a human face, there's clearly some bathroom tile, there's a shadow being cast, and there's a distinct sense of what forms are being conveyed and what objects are there, with a very, very simple economy of just two values and a really distinct sense of what shapes are going on. This is a pen and ink work by Joseph Clement Cole. There's a little bit more of gradual, there's a couple more values in here. There's about maybe 3 or 4 values that I see here, but it's a really clear sense that there's a distinct shadow side of the side of his head, of his brow. Definitely on facial features, you want a clear sense of a light and shadow side to get really emotional, I'm sorry for my stuttering here, theatrical, distinct differences between the shadow and light side here. Another really fantastic example, especially for environment work, is film noir work. Some of the old detective film noir films from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s give a very wonderful sense of light and shadow side, and it also adds the sense of staging and drama to the scene, like some of these old Bogart detective scenes. This is another example showcasing light and shadow on the face, and there's clearly just only 1 or 2, maybe 3 values, and it's really being demonstrated here in a really strong sense. Another Frazetta artwork piece here, you can clearly see here really strong light and shadow shapes being demonstrated on the lips, the eyebrows, or the brow of the eyes, the underside of the chest here. You could almost, if you really want to get graphical here, you could probably put this whole entire leg and arm in a complete dark black value, same with here. You can see there's a little bit of reflected light going into here that you can see again, like what we were demonstrating earlier, there's that terminating plane value change where it's completely in shadow, and then it falls into a complete dark value, and then the global illumination coming from down here off the landscape is illuminating the side here. Really wonderful shot, showcasing that again, the shadow is casting everything in complete black, but it still showcases so much that this figure, the cast shadow, the interior space, the sense of perspective of the camera shot. This is a really, really wonderful shot to showcase what light and shadow composition can do to a scene here. Another Frank Miller piece, again, showing just two distinct values and how clear you can get a sense of emotion and a clear sense of image conveying just with two values. And that's what we're going to showcase here in plopping down just a single directional light into the scene here. So we have first the scene that we've had before. I'm going to get rid of this foliage just so we don't have it in the scene. I just wanted to demonstrate that in the last chapter to showcase how to use foliage when working with light baking. I'm going to scale this box back down to give a sense of the scale of the player here. And so now I'm going to go back to my details panel and switch this over to a movable light. Those little bits of text that you're seeing, it's called preview, just showing that light baking has not yet happened. In order to get rid of that, I believe let's see, show stats, I think. Let's see, I know it's around here somewhere. I won't waste time looking for it, but there's a way that you can turn off the preview mode. I might put into the next video a way that you can turn it off, but honestly, we're changing it to movable anyway, so it doesn't really matter because the preview text goes away as soon as we have that show up. So just moving this around here, you can see that the main thing, like this is a really great shot to show that there's a sense of rim light, that this is completely in shadow, but it still showcases a sense of contrast going with the black void of the atmosphere and then the white outline essentially of the form that's going on. The rim lighting is very, very important in photography, and you can see here that you get this sort of best of both worlds where you get a dark silhouette against the lit background here, and then you can also get a light outline against the dark background here. So with the way that this sun is positioned, it's a really great way to showcase showing off form. So just with this shot here, with this dynamic or this directional light setup, it's a really great way to showcase a strong sense of dramatic lighting going on here. If I turn the directional light value here, you can see that, and I also turn it so it's a little more parallel to the horizon, something like evening, where another thing I'm going to do too here is I'm going to click off the snap to angle by 10 degrees. So now it's a way more smooth moving of the directional light here. So I'm moving it over this side. And so you can see here, what I'm doing is I can have something like the environment here is completely lit, but I'm casting the shadows based off the way that the sun direction is following, where the foreground is completely in shadow, which does a really great way of separating the foreground from the middle ground and background. A really great way to add a sense of foreboding drama. And as I just move the camera around, you can see with different ways that. And one thing I'll do too, just to showcase how the atmosphere will probably work, unless this was a scene in space or something like that, what I'm going to do is take away any of the color and just have a simple atmospheric fog in there, just to give a sense of atmospheric perspective as well as a dark light and shadow, because you can still see some pretty strong light and value shapes are going on here. I might also just turn this down a bit. And so that kind of puts the scene in a really nice sort of pre-color cinematography mode, which I think is looking pretty nice to experiment with what the light and shadow shapes are going to be doing. As I bring this more and more perpendicular to the horizon, you can see again the cast shadow is probably one of the most powerful things as far as demonstrating what the overall lighting composition is going to do. And what's really nice is in 2D form, calculating cast shadows is a pretty tough thing to do back in the day. Back to when we were looking at the perspective layout and how much math was needed to grid out and accurately map up perspective when you were drawing it. The same goes for cast shadows, where you need to calculate where the source of the of your source of light is, and then casting back down where the shadows are going to do based off how it's hitting the surface. It was a lot of kind of the same perspective vector math that you had to play in your head, and it was pretty daunting to do. But now, with our setup here, we just literally just swing this light around, and it's all just updated in real time for us. This is another, again, really nice sense of rim light, a great sense of sort of foreboding, foreshadowing in the center here. Another thing to do, of course, is to accurately map out where the shadows are going to be cast based off where your objects are in the world. So you can see here, if I move this rock a little bit more, so it's not just moving the light, it's also moving the objects in your scene to get better cast shadows going on. You just want to make sure that you don't enclose too much. One thing you can do is that's kind of cheating, is if you have a single camera view that is only going to be seen from one particular view, you can just put a bunch of essentially light blockers into the scene, something like this, and you just keep placing them until they essentially block the light completely from the scene. But then you have, of course, a bunch of floating blocker objects if you're moving around in the scene. So you just want to make sure that if you're doing a 3D scene like a game environment, that's not the case, and that you just have a smart layout of what's going to be going on with your light and your objects to cast accurate shadows. Another great angle here that, again, keeping the foreground completely in shadow while illuminating the middle ground and background here. And another thing we can do that could be interesting is if I swing this around so that the foreground is completely lit, but there's something that completely blocks out the middle ground or background. Let me grab one of the bush cloud pieces here, crank it up to 600. And then if I do something like this could be a great like storm cloud or something like that. I'm going to switch this around really quick here. Something like that is nice and dramatic too, where the foreground is completely lit up and the middle ground is completely in shadow. It's another great way to completely separate with values what's going on with the shadow shapes here. So if I move this around, create something like a really dark, foreboding storm front or something like that. Yeah, that's pretty cool to see. Yeah, cloud shapes, never neglect your cloud shapes. This is a really great way too to get a sense of emotional foreboding of like the player having to go into a darker or more foreboding space here. This would be a really great way to convey it. Another great part of this too, a big part of the workflow is just to work with experimentation. We have such a powerful tool set here, which is, you know, just realistic, real-time updating dynamic lighting. So a lot of this time I'm really just swinging the light around and just seeing what kind of shapes or objects I can get here. Also playing with the camera here with what kind of cast shadow work I can get here with the relationship of the foreground to the background. Usually when you want to do something like the golden hour, you can get accurate sense where it's shining directly down onto the scene. Another thing I might do is what's nice is you don't modify the directional light at all by just moving it around. I'm going to move it closer to the camera just so I can see what direction the actual sunlight is pointing in. And yeah, directional light going straight down it's definitely accurate to the real world, but it's a little bit, it's kind of tough to get interesting, accurate shapes if it's just shining straight down, like if you're in a desert in the middle of the day, or if it's high noon. Oh, also, another thing I should point out that is the sun, unless you're directly on the equator, the sun will never shine directly down, perfectly perpendicular to the scene. I found that out recently when I was working at my day job with a lighting artist or environment artist that told me it's like, yeah, there's only one place, there's only a few specific places where the sun is shining directly straight down. It's always at a bit of an angle because the world is tilted on its axis, and so therefore the sun rays are always at a little bit of an angle, even in the middle of high noon. So interesting little fact to keep in mind there. Another thing you want to make sure too is if you have very, very large objects in the background, and to make sure that they're casting shadows, one thing you want to do is go into their lighting tab here and click on far shadow just to make sure that the directional light is capturing the form and casting an accurate shadow. And going into the directional light here, I'm going to go to distance field shadows. Under cascade shadow maps, I'm going to go to far shadow distance, turn this up to 5, and then extend this all the way to 80,000 or 800,000 just to make sure that these are being taken into account when casting shadows stretching across the landscape here, which it looks like they are. Another great thing too is to have, again, just a lot of experimentation and just also keeping into mind too, all the work that we were putting into perspective with shape layout, with the atmospheric perspective, and then bouncing of shapes. The light and the shadow shapes are just that, shapes themselves. So you want to make sure that the sense of bounce of the golden ratio, rule of thirds, all those simple mathematical equations that make an interesting image are being taken into account too with the light and the shadow shapes, because we're adding new shapes into the shape composition that we've already made with the shape arrangement in the previous chapter. So if I go to my bookmarks, bookmark 0, this is looking pretty good where we have those shape layouts, and with the light and shadow shapes, we're not losing a sense of what's important. We have a nice distinct lit and shadow side here. We have nice silhouettes with a bit of form lighting going on here. If I go to bookmark number 2, switching over here, this is okay. Nothing really great. There's a lot of kind of washed out just because everything is perpendicular to the sunlight here. So if I do something like take another rock, maybe scale it up, and then get a sense of sort of a cast shadow going on here, or at every angle, again, as it gets more and more complicated, it's going to get more and more challenging to get a perfect sense of shape composition with all these factors playing into it. So, and yeah, just with kind of working around a bit, that's a pretty good sense of, hey, we have a decent shape composition, and we have also some decent lighting and shadow composition going on here. Let me go to bookmark 3 here. And again, these bookmarks are just kind of taking a 360 sort of screenshot around the world here. I'm going to place down maybe another tree or two here on this side. Maybe switch this out for a bush cloud shape to go with it. But again, not too bad of a compositional shape here. I'm going to maybe scale this down here. We can get a nice sense of atmospheric perspective too, going back into the valley here. Maybe lower the border a little bit to get more of a sense of the distance behind there. Yeah, that's nice. And then this is kind of all in shadow from what I'm seeing here, but that might not be too bad of a thing. Because if the light angle, if you kind of have your priority shot, which is bookmark 1 here, if it's a good composition shot here, I think this can sort of, you don't want to move the light just so you can get more, you can try, or I will try to get a illuminated shot here, but it doesn't really get the result that I'd like. But actually, if I took this away, I could open up less shadow being cast across the landscape here and maybe get something a little bit more interesting. Maybe lower that a little bit, bring it up like so. So that's a pretty nice setup shot there. So what I can do is I'm just going to rename this really quick. Just give it a underscore 01. Or setup 01. Then I'm just going to duplicate that, hide that. That's called setup 02, so I'm just going to swing this around and see what other kind of composition setup I can get there. So you can see from this shot here, now I have a way cooler light and shadow composition going on from this angle. So, and again, too, another factor I'm not taking into account here is if you have dynamic day and night cycles in your game world, you'll just have to set up, sort of the workaround to see what kind of light and shadow shapes will unfold once the sun is sort of passing through the sky here. And with that, you'll just have to kind of arrange the landscape to make sure that you get interesting light and shadow shapes going on. So we're looking into the sunlight here. So one thing I can do as well, I'm going to turn off the, well, instead of turning off the exponential high fog, what I might do is just turn down its value a little bit, something to 0.001 or 0.0001. That's interesting. Let me see, let me set these back to the default value. What I might do instead is bring down the local value here. So I'm going to crank the actual color of the exponential height fog down to something like that. And I'm going to take in something like a point light. I'm going to turn down the volume also too, or the value also too on the exponential height fog. Then I can see here, whoa, that is, there we go. So you can see here what sort of interesting light and shadow shapes we can get with just a single ominous light in the atmosphere here. This is a really wonderful way to have something very sort of foreboding, or, I mean, it's just a very, very easy way to just have the eye just snap to a single point in the scene here. There's no doubt about it. So if it's something like that, actually, let me just turn off the high fog altogether for this. Or let me try one more time, bring this value down to something like 0.001. There we go. So the fog value is very, very low. I'm going to turn the fog density back up a little bit. And on this point light here, I'm going to go under volumetric scattering. And actually, I'm going to set that back to a default value here. But you can see here another great way if it's, obviously if it's something like nighttime, if it's something like, you can see this very strange banding going on here. Let me see if I can get rid of that with the ray trace shadows. There we go. So that really nasty banding that you're seeing there, the ray trace distance shadows will take care of that artifact. So something like this, if I took something, say, like the player and put him up here, you can see this is a very powerful sense of not only illuminating this object or player or whatever point of interest with a powerful rim light, but also creating a very dynamic cast shadow going across the landscape there, sort of projecting what's projecting the presence of the object of interest here. And with a more accurate sense here, you can get some really beautiful, emotional, dramatic shots here with what's going on. And so that's just with a single point light. I can swing it over here, see if I put it down in here, you can see if I dig into this landscape and place this light down into this hole that I have set up here or something like that. Let me just do that. You can see a couple shots like this in some film noir horror movies, and this is a really great way to get a sense of something very interesting or foreboding inside or down in a space that the player would go into. So something like this. Now, granted, when it comes to gameplay, you want to make sure that the player has a clear sense of where the player has a sense of where the player is going. So when it comes to very dramatic scenes like this, it's a little bit tricky, and you need to make sure that you're providing enough light to make sure that the player can see what's going on with their avatar or with the character in the game or anything like that. So if you're doing scenes like this, you probably want to have some sort of little bit of cheating. And one way to do that, of course, is you could parent this light to the player. So if I take that, select that, and let me see here. If I take the spotlight, attach the spotlight to this box here, I can have it so that the spotlight's always following the player, or following the character, so at least the player can have a sense that the player isn't really bumping into anything. So important thing to have, just so you know, the player isn't sort of knocking around in the dark trying to find their way to go in dramatic scenes like this. Another thing you do, of course, is take a very powerful spotlight like this and place it behind an object, just to give a sense of a powerful illuminating spotlight, like so. If I really crank it up, you can see that, yeah, you get a really nice sense of dramatic lighting going on. Something like a ritual or dig site, or this always gives an indication of some important sense of action going on behind a large scene here. And all you have to do is just hide it behind these objects here to give a sense of something very interesting happening behind these dark silhouettes here. Something like that. And of course, the one final thing, I can have a really powerful spotlight and see what kind of effects we can get from that. And this is great, of course, for really dramatic scenes that follow the player. And this is important too, of course, for interior spaces where you'd have man-made lights shining down upon the player. So this would illuminate, like lamps or lights attached to the ceiling or the walls, things like that. And this is especially important for like RTSs or something where the camera would be way up here for a top-down. You could, again, either attach this to the player or you could have it set up in certain areas around the world. So something like that where this is literally like stage lighting, where there'd be a very strong sense of an almost like definitive light shining down on a specific scene, having the player know where to go. So something like that. Like obviously you would put something of interest in the center of that pool of light there to direct the player. So as far as directing the player around, it's a very easy, interesting way to have these pools of light to direct the player across a specific play space like this. So I just sort of direct these pools of light going through here. So with exploring these different elements of how to experiment with light with just a simple lit and shadow side to set up shape composition, we'll start going into the next chapter, which will start looking into one of the biggest factors with setting up an environment or a landscape is color, and how it will apply to setting up our final composition. So In the next chapter, we'll be looking into local color and how it affects the scene.